Good morning, folks. That one's for you. I don't have a microphone, so or we can't get the mics to work, so you're going to have to forgive me. I don't know how well you can hear me in the back. I'm going to close the door to the kitchen, thank you. Or I'm going to go there and cook, one or the other. I just joined you from, I think I got in about 9:30, 10 o'clock last night. Actually, I had a 4-hour layover in Atlanta. And I had once, a long time, I do a lot of traveling. I speak about 40 times a year. So my last event, I thought I'm never going to go to a secondary market again because, and this is why, by the way, why you guys don't get a lot of people, is that second airplane flight. It's like fine to go from LA to Atlanta, but then from here, it's 4 hours at Atlanta airport because the plane had problems. So anyway, not your problem, but I'm glad to be here. And anybody who might have joined us for dinner last night, I'm really sorry I didn't make it. I was sitting at the airport at the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf. You could have found me at Atlanta Airport in the D concourse and Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf for about 4 hours. You got a great consultation on cases. Probably, I would imagine nobody knows me. I don't think anybody's heard me speak before. Can you raise your hand if you have? Okay, great. That's good. And are there any CSATs or people trained in sexual disorders in the room? Any ASEC people? Wow, so nobody knows about sex. Has anyone ever had sex? Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. One woman in the room has had sex. Well, we'll talk later. God, and you're so close to DC. I'm just thinking. Let me just tell you a little of my background before I get started. I did ask for 2 hours without a break, which just means that you can, at any point, take care of yourselves, go to the potty, use your phone. I just can't give you as much information I want to if we have to do it in an hour and a half. In fact, I can't do it in 2. This will be a day's worth of material in 2 hours, which means that you're not going to be able to leave here and say, I know how to treat sex addiction. You're not going to leave here necessarily knowing a lot more than how to identify the issue and maybe how to make some referrals. And maybe if you really get something out of this, you might be interested in getting more training. And I will point you toward how to get that training. In the bags that you picked up on the way in or the packets, there are articles on the work that I do. The slide set is in there. There is a resource sheet with 12-step programs, books to read, places for more trainings for clinicians. All of that social work stuff is blockers and filters for computers and what are the best ones to use for clients. All that stuff is on your resource sheet. So you have a pretty good bunch of material that you can use that we've brought with us. Just a little bit of my background before we start. I want you to just, I want you all to see me if you can see me. I wanted to say that I am a sex addict, and I think that's important for me to say. I went many years, I've been in the field since I was an active sex addict from 14 to 25. I tell you that because there's no face for my disorder. You know, there are lots of people who tell you they're alcoholics, drug addicts, gambling disorders, eating disorders. Not many people come out and talk about having a sex addiction problem. And the issue, and the problem with that is if you don't have a face, then it's just some phantom on a screen, one of those sleazy, perverted people. Not that I'm not, but I'll just briefly tell you, I grew up in a home with a profoundly mentally ill mother. My mother was bipolar, and really the worst kind. She would cycle every 18 months. And 2 psychosis, 2 running down the street naked, 2 ambulances and into places like this, and then out in 4 days because she wouldn't stay. Or if she did, they gave her ECT and Thorazine, and then I'd come home and have a very different mom than the one who left when she was manic. So I grew up not very comfortable with or trusting of intimate relationships, or that attachment and nurturing would provide me with the needs that I had as a child. And that's a really hard lesson when you're an adult. And I would say that almost all the clients I work with have some kind of underlying intimacy disorder or problem with making use of healthy attachments in order to get their emotional needs met. Doesn't mean they don't get married, doesn't mean they don't get in relationships, but they're not honest with their partners, they keep them at a distance, they make up all kinds of things in their heads about them, and then they go out and act out. I have worked in the field, as I said, for about 22 years. You heard that Pat Carnes was I got to work with him in a residential setting very much like this for about 4 years. So I really learned in residential treatment everything you can probably know about working with sex addicts, both male and female. And I've done a fair amount of work with offenders. So I have a pretty well-rounded experience. I've written 4 books on the topic, one for gay men who are sex addicts, since I am a gay man as a sex addict, and there wasn't a book, and that book is called Cruise Control. So if you ever run into a sex addict who is gay and they say to you, oh, well, you just understand this is what gay guys do, meaning having 100 partners a week or something, get the book and read it. You'll understand that's not what gay guys do. That's what sex addicts do. And you know what? You can be straight and do that too. So, and you can be a woman and do that too. So I've written a lot and have a great interest in technology and the intersection of digital technology and sexuality, digital technology and intimacy and relationships. I'm going to talk some about that. Those of you who are parents, I'll talk a little bit about all the porn your kids are seeing and all of the new ways that they have of addressing and interacting with each other. And you might find I have a slightly different perspective than most people do on the topic. But mostly I'm here to talk about sex addiction. I opened an agency in '95, ran it for 18 years, so I know I've supervised clinicians, managed clinicians, spoken all over the world about this topic. And I'm very fortunate now to work for Elements, which allows me to evolve programming. So now I run around the country and I evolve programs. I go into a facility that we purchase and I say, could we put sexual disorders programming in here? Of what kind? Who would best suit? All that kind of stuff. We have about 4 programs running in the country right now. So, including the one I started in '95. So I'm going to talk about this issue that doesn't exist. And I will do my best to give you some time for questions, which is not my best thing because as a bit of a narcissist, I tend to race through things and then say, oh, I'm glad they got a lot out of that. And you're all thinking, boy, we got a lot of questions. Since we are talking about sex and since we are sort of in this, what's a better way of saying this? Since we are in a more conservative area of the country, I live in California, so have a very different, slightly different perspective on things. If you have a question that you want to ask that you're not comfortable asking, please write it down. And we will collect them, somewhere around the middle, or you can certainly ask a question. But not everyone's going to want to say, I want to learn more about compulsive masturbation. That may not be comfortable for you. It is for me, but it's not for you. And that's fine. So why don't we get started? I find the best way to talk about this topic is to talk about what it isn't, because I think there's a lot of misnomers and a lot of mythology about this, both good and bad. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. And then we'll start to talk about what it is. First of all, and before I do that, let me tell you who I have coming in to see me. My average client is a 30-year, my most average client who comes in for sex addiction, just pure, that's my problem, they're not drinking and using, they don't have other major mental health disorders, they're mostly functional. And I've seen that population since I started. My average client is a 35-year-old male who has been married for about 11 years, maybe 10 years, has 2 children under the age of 8 at home, has been acting out sexually a lot in adolescence and early adulthood, or problems with intimacy and relationships, wasn't really recognized as such because that's what a lot of teenagers and young people were doing. He found a girl, she was the one, they fell in love, they were drawn to each other like in West Side Story, just like instant pathology match, And she's somewhat intimacy avoidant, him somewhat intimacy desperate. They fall in love, they're completely attached, they have sex every moment, they can't get apart from each other, everyone thinks they're a wonderful couple, they get married, and then somewhere about 2 years in the relationship, he returns to the sexual acting out that he began, that he was doing before they got married. And he, by the way, thought, well, I don't really have a problem with sex and intimacy, I just had never met the right person. Because when he meets her, he's like, oh, this is it, I've got it. And then something happens that causes him to start to act out sexually again during the course of their relationship. And I'm not talking about the occasional affair or seeing or going to a strip club. I'm talking about repetitive patterns of problem sexual behavior that go on and on and on and on and on. So, by the way, what do you guys think, and this is audience participation, might be the trigger for him to returning to act out in my most common patient? What happens at 2 years in the marriage that you think leads him to, pardon? They talk about having children. And her gaze turns away from him for a second and starts to go to her body and childbearing, and then there are children, and he starts to get internally resentful. Why aren't I getting the attention? Why aren't I getting the focus? Because his narcissistic wound is uncovered because he's not getting that seal of perfect attention from her. And so he starts to look for, in his mind, he starts to devalue her. We haven't had sex. We're not having sex anymore. I mean, ever since she had those kids 45 days ago, we're not having sex anymore, and I don't get it, and she doesn't look like she did, and I'm not, so he starts to build a case, and then he goes out and starts having sex with prostitutes or looking at lots of porn. And then about 6 years later, she goes to the computer and she finds thousands of pictures and all these email contacts. And she says, what's going on? And he said, oh, it's just a guy thing. It's like Playboy. It's what my dad did. And then she doesn't feel quite comfortable with that, so she goes to the computer and actually finds out that there have been affairs and sexual contacts and all that stuff. And then she says, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. You get some help or you're out of here. And that is what I call a wife-driven referral. And that's about 60%, 60 to 70% of my referrals are something like that. What I usually find that these men have underlying attachment disorders, early sexual trauma. Sometimes they have developed mental or personality-based issues, all of which lead them away from intimacy and toward intensity. My clients seek intensity when what they need is comfort. So that's my basic client. I would say the other population that I treat, there's two others. One is women. And I've been working, I was fortunate enough to be the person who was able to develop the only dedicated programs for women in the United States who have sex and intimacy disorders. There are two of them now. And I learned a lot about women from that. You know, much higher rates of sexual abuse in the female population, much higher rates of chemical dependency unresolved, much higher rates of eating disorders unresolved. These women bounce back and forth from chemical dependency programs to eating disorder programs. And guess what? No one ever asked them about sex. Or if they do, they ask them about their sexual trauma, but they don't talk to them about their current sexual lives. I don't understand. I assume most of your clinicians working in or around facilities in some way, or you may see clients yourselves and interview them. It makes no sense to me why someone can go into a treatment center or a mental health institution and they get asked about exercise, eating, spending, education, social life, family issues, and no one asks them about sex. That doesn't make any sense to me. Because I know that a lot of people have sexual abuse, a lot of people have intimacy disorders, a lot of people have those kinds of issues, and they will act out over them and they will relapse over them. So women will frequently relapse over their sexual behavior or their relationship problems. Men will pair sexual behavior problems with drug disorders like meth and sex, like coke and sex. I have a whole population of transgender and sexual orientation confusion guys who drink and use because they hate themselves for what they feel they are, and so they go out there in order to have the sex they like, they drink or use, or in order to tolerate their feelings about the kind of sex that they like, they drink and use. And they also can't get sober because they hate themselves so much for their sexual issues. So there are a lot of ways that sexuality plays into relapse for drug addicts and alcoholics, and that is another area of great interest for me, and we have programs for that. So what sex addiction isn't? First of all, it's not diagnosed if I have a pre-existing major mental health disorder, so that is driving the hypersexuality. You know, people who are manic can be hypersexual. And when they're stable and no longer manic, they're not hypersexual. So that would not be a sex addict. Someone might have OCD and be very compulsive about masturbation along with counting all the ceiling tiles and whatever else they're obsessed about. And yet when they're stable on medication, they stop compulsively masturbating. So I have to rule out those kind of diagnoses before I say, oh, this person has some kind of addictive sexual disorder. But that's not to say that someone couldn't be, as they could be if they were alcoholic, also have ADD or also have OCD or also be bipolar, so you might have a differential diagnosis situation. It just depends on the person. So assessment is really important, and that means you have to ask a lot of questions about sex. And not everyone's comfortable with that. So how do you do this assessment if you're not comfortable with those questions? It's just a thought for you. Sex addiction is not poorly researched. That is also a myth. We have an enormous amount of Tier 1 peer-reviewed research that went to the APA for the proposed DSM-5 diagnosis, which was refused, and we'll talk about that. But there is more definitive research on compulsive addictive sexuality than any other sexual pathology in the current DSM. All the paraphilias, orientation issues, there's less research on all of those than we have together for hypersexuality. So there are reasons why the diagnosis hasn't made the DSM, and I can speak a little bit to that. But since we're in the Virginia, Baltimore, Washington, I mean, I know you're far from there, but not too far. It's political. How about that? I'll leave it at that. Well, I'll talk about it more later. Sex addiction is not fun. Sex is fun. I hope it's fun for you. Intimate sexuality is fun. Relational sexuality is fun. Recreational sexuality is fun. So's drinking. For most of us, have a glass of wine, have a few beers, maybe get drunk at New Year's, not a problem. But if you're an alcoholic, drinking is not so fun. You know, and for that small percentage of the population that has a problem with alcohol, they cannot drink like everyone else. And drinking for them is driving into trees, hitting their wife, losing their job, all that. And so for a sex addict, which is a small percentage of the population, those people don't get to have or are unable to have the kinds of recreational, non-intimate sexual experiences that most other people can have, because once they start down that road, they run off the rails, just like an alcoholic, just like a compulsive gambler. That is their problem. So the problem is not sex, and the problem is not having fun with sex, and the problem is not having a lot of sex. The problem is what goes on in your brain, the person who is engaging in the behavior, when they get involved with non-relational, objectified sexual experiences and where they end up. I'll put these up together. Actually, is it? Yeah, oh, this is together. So let me go back one. Sorry. For me to say that someone is a sex addict, if you will, and I'll use other phrases for that in a second, it's not a moral judgment. I don't care if you're into leather. I don't care if you like to smell men's shoes. I'm really not fine with me if you like polyamory and you're interested in 3 partners. It's none of my business the kind of sexuality that you choose to engage in if it is consensual and you're happy with it. I work with people for whom I work with people whose sexual behavior has caused them to lose their jobs, to lose their relationships, to get arrested, to get diseases, to pass on diseases. And they don't just do this once, they do it multiple times over the years, and they clearly have early either developmental or emotional or attachment or trauma challenges that have driven them to avoid intimate relationships and to seek out intensity-based experiences as a means of escape. It is not up to me to decide as a clinician, you know, what's right and wrong or good and bad. I don't apply my moral or religious values as much as possible into my work. I want to put up these because sex addiction is not defined, as I just said, by what turns you on. It's not really determined by who turns you on. So someone might come into me and say, you know what, I've been married for 8 years to a woman and I have 3 kids, but you know, once or twice a year when I go to Vegas on a business trip, I have sex with men and I really hate myself about that and I don't know why I do that, and you know, I think I'm a sex addict. Well, once or twice a year when you go to Vegas, that's not sex addiction. That might be a whole bunch of things. I don't know what that is. Could be closeted homosexuality, could be bisexuality, could be trauma response, you know, I don't know, but that's not sex addiction. So just because you engage in a sexual behavior that you don't feel good about and you don't like and you wish you could change, and you come into me and you say, I've been seeing men occasionally, or I'm really into being tied up, you know, and I don't like that about myself, and my wife is really disgusted by it, and I hate that, and I want to change it. Well, that doesn't make a sex addict. That means you have a fetish, or you have an unresolved sexual orientation issue, or you have sexual orientation dysphoria, or you know, lots of other issues can be at stake, which might bring someone to say, I don't like my sexual behavior and I want to change it. And just because they don't like their sexual behavior and they want to change it, that doesn't make them a sex addict. So there's gender dysphoria. How many of you work with crystal meth addicts? Or have? Can you keep your hands up just so I can see? Okay. I have a message for you from that community. Please talk to them about sex. And don't just talk to them about the sex that they had when they were using, but they really need to talk about that. Because a lot of people will engage in sexual acts when they're high that they later have shame or embarrassment about, but they've never told anyone. And as my friend Pat Carnes would say, sexual secrets are the ones that we often have the most shame about, and they're the ones we're least likely to tell anyone. So they're dying to talk about it. And crystal meth addicts in particular, and coke addicts as well, stimulant addicts in general, often engage in a lot of running off the rails sexual behavior. They need to talk about that because you don't want them leaving here carrying that shame around. Or leaving wherever they are. The other thing that I would bring you from that community is they need to talk about what is sober sex. If you are a crystal meth addict and you've been running off having sex for 3 days with strangers doing Viagra and not sleeping, and you're used to doing that a couple of times a month, going out and having a date is not going to be very interesting. Having sex with one person is not going to be very interesting. These people, both straight and gay, will return to the people and places where they found that really hot, intense sex, and guess where the drugs are? So they will go back to the prostitutes, the bathhouses, the clubs, whatever it is, seeking that intense sexual high because it was paired with the drug use, and then they end up getting high again. And if you don't treat them for sexual issues as well as drug issues, they will relapse over that. And those of you who treat meth, and I have strong feelings about this myself, know that the relapse rates are like in the 80%. You know, they're really, really high. And so I want to give someone who has a meth or a stimulant problem every opportunity to get well, and that means that I have to talk to them about what their sexual behavior is going to be when they leave treatment. Enough said about them. The last thing I want to say, and this is probably the most important thing about this slide, is that, or about the whole thing for me really in this particular talk, is that sex addiction is not sexual offending. And let me explain the difference. Sexual offending is a legal term. It's different from place to place. So if I go to Thailand, what's considered to be sexual offending is very different than what is considered to be sexual offending in California. And then if I go to Arkansas, it might be considered to be different than Ohio. So how do I define sexual offending as a clinical term if I'm not a lawyer and I'm not looking to define it legally? Sexual offending is simply non-consensual sexual behavior. So can I ask your name? Do you mind? Brichelle. I'm sorry? Brichelle. Couldn't be just Karen or something. Okay, sorry. Okay, Brichelle. So let's say Brichelle and I were, getting it on, and we were great, and we were dating, and we were having a great time, and she said, Rob, if you come by my window at 7:30, I'm going to be undressing and taking a shower, and I want you to look in because you're going to see the best parts of me. I have not offended her if I'm standing outside her window at 7:30 because she has asked me to do that. That's consensual. But if I show up outside of her window at 7:30 and she doesn't know I'm there and she looks outside and goes, ah, and calls the police, that's offending because it's non-consensual. If someone is not of an age to consent or doesn't have the conscious ability to consent, that's offending. So about 90% of the people that I treat are engaged in consensual sexual acts that are repetitive and problematic because of their repetition. They're not crossing the boundaries for the most part into offending behaviors. Now some are offending online because online offending is not illegal in a lot of ways that it is in the real world. Some people do run off the rails online, but in general, my folks are not trying to make people be sexual with them who don't want to be sexual with them in any way. They're looking for the approval. They're looking for the validation. They're looking to be desired and wanted. It's a narcissistic wound that they're trying to feed over and over again. So they would not want to push someone into something that person would be uncomfortable with because they don't want to see the unhappy face. They want to see the I want you face. So most sex addicts don't offend. Now, what are they doing if they're not offending? Well, here's typical stuff that sex addicts are out there doing. They're compulsively using porn with or without masturbation. And today, as you probably know, you can use porn with your phone. So it's pretty easy to 24/7, wherever you are, gather up some porn. They're anonymously hooking up with people they meet online and with their phones. They're going to adult bookstores and strip clubs. They're exchanging sex for drugs or for favors, and I see this a lot in women, where even women with means will sell themselves for money or gifts or drugs because it gives them a sense of power. And so for these women, they don't prostitute themselves necessarily to pay the rent. They do it because maybe they have sexual abuse issues, and this is a way of kind of acting it out in a way where they feel a sense of control. So even though you're using me, you're paying me, so I've got you, and that's unlike what I grew up with when I was a victim. So that's not unusual for the women. Sex addicts are seeing prostitutes. They're going to sensual massage parlors. Do you have sensual massage parlors in Virginia? Yeah, someone said yes. One person said yes. One brave person. So I love that word because I have clients who will come in and say, oh yeah, I don't have problems with sex. I just go for sensual massages. Okay, how often do you go? 3 times a week. Okay, you must need a lot of massage. So, so you see prostitutes 3 times a week. Oh no, I don't see prostitutes. Because no man really wants to be caught seeing prostitutes because that's an insult to his ego. So, well, let's see, you lie down at a table, they rub you all over with oil, they masturbate you to orgasm, then you pay them money. How's that not seeing a prostitute? And that's simply confronting denial in my world, because if I can get that person to own something they don't want to own, I've sort of shifted their thinking a little bit. So sex addicts going to prostitutes, to massage parlors, they're cruising, they're intriguing, they're objectifying. There's always some kind of sense of, ooh, who can I get to get something going? Whose card can I get at lunch? And it isn't just about sex. It's also about who can I flirt with? Who can I get a card from? Who can I depend on to meet up with me later? It's about intrigue, really anything that will feed a rush of adrenaline, endorphins, dopamine, and all that nice, all those nice internal drugs that process addicts use to get high. Sex addicts will push boundaries. They view no as a challenge. We often have professionals who are in treatment, physicians, attorneys, therapists who are crossing boundaries. I'll have a doc, for example, who, let's say, is a pediatric doctor and he's treating someone's child, but having sex with the mother and saying, well, I'm not having sex with my patient. You know, that kind of pushing boundaries where they can justify it to themselves. They have multiple affairs, either one after another, or often they'll be having an affair and they'll be seeing a prostitute and they'll stop off and see an old girlfriend on their way home. So they have multiple things going on. They're kind of juggling sexual and romantic experiences all at the same time. They're more and more using their smartphones for hookups, using apps, and we'll talk about that. They're sexting. Anthony Weiner would be the most famous case of that. They're abusing social networks. They're engaged in virtual sexuality because there are virtual sexual worlds now. As I said, they cross professional boundaries. And most of all, they live a double life. You know, sex addicts, by the way, sex addicts are great in treatment if they're not also drug addicts because they're so awake. You know, my clients don't take 3 weeks to clear before they're ready for treatment. They're already living 3 lives. You know, I just have to get them down to one that has integrity where everything is talked about, and they are much better really quickly. They're not better in the initial wounding that they had. That's a long-term psychotherapeutic issue, but in terms of their shame, their self-hatred, that addictive cycle, the isolation they're living in, I mean, all that gets lifted in treatment, they become a lot more available and a lot more present pretty quickly. I did want to say something, by the way, about Anthony Weiner really quickly. I've not met him, nor have I assessed him. But I thought it was interesting in the media over the summer where this man was just brutally attacked again. And what was he attacked for? He was attacked because it came out that he had continued sexting women after he'd lost his congressional seat. And everyone said, why wouldn't somebody who's had those kind of consequences stop that behavior? I mean, what kind of crazy is he? But if you treat addicts, you understand that someone who gets a DUI doesn't stop drinking that night. You know, someone who is a gambling addict doesn't lose their kid's college fund and say, oh, I get it, I need to stop. They just go take out a loan. So it can take a while for people, even in who's had the most severe consequences, to stop their behavior, because the only thing the consequences does is push someone into crisis and hopefully into treatment if they're lucky. If they don't only get into crisis, then they might continue to engage in the behavior because that's their primary means of coping. So it made perfect sense to me that this guy would continue to do it after he'd lost his position because that's how he copes. What else is he going to do? His wife has left him. He has no job. He's sitting around his apartment by himself. Why wouldn't he get online and sex to women? I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. But I can understand as someone who doesn't understand addiction that wouldn't make sense. You would think, because most people have a consequence, like with drinking or drugs, and they say, oh my gosh, look at this consequence. I don't want to do this anymore, unless you're an addict, in which case you keep doing it. And I would say that is probably what happened in New York a couple of years ago, but I'm just guessing. All right, so how much sex equals addiction? I mean, let's get down to the good stuff. I mean, like, how much sex do you have to be a sex addict? And my question to you would be, well, how many drinks makes an alcoholic? Or how much money do you have to spend to be a compulsive gambler? Or how many meals do you have to eat to have an eating disorder? And you're like, okay, but all right, Rob, fine. But what about what kind of sex you have? I mean, surely you can define it by what kind of sex you have. You know, and I would say to you, well, what kind of alcohol means you're an alcoholic? Is it vodka or wine? What kind of gambling means you have a gambling disorder? Is it blackjack or craps? Because the reality is that we don't define addiction quantitatively. We define it qualitatively. How is this behavior or substance affecting the quality of this person's life, their functionality? Are they losing their ability to function effectively with their family, with their spouse, with their job, with their day-to-day life because of this behavior or substance, or both? And that's how we look at sex addiction, in the same way as we look at all the other addictions. So, is sexual addiction a mental health diagnosis? Does it count? Well, in the DSM-3, it did. There was a descriptor under sexual disorders, NOS, called sexual addiction. And you could say someone had sexual addiction, and it was a DSM diagnosis. And then right around 1990, and the DSM-4 came out, it was taken out. And I always find that really cool and interesting, because what happened in the early 90s to our culture? What showed up that made the most major change we've seen in our entire existence since nuclear war? The internet. So just as people were lining up and getting caught up, some people, in online porn and online hooking up, and I started to have what had started in 95 to be a trickle, but by 98 was a torrent of people coming into treatment, just as we evolved the technology to make intensely pleasurable experiences that much more accessible, that much more immediate, it was taken out of the DSM, which I think is just interesting. And then it is no longer being considered for the DSM-5. I do recommend, if you're really interested in the topic, go to the APA website and download the paper written about hypersexual disorder, which was the title of it. A man by the name of Marty Kafka, who's an MD at Harvard, wrote the proposed diagnosis. He knew that addiction would never fly because, as you all know, the word addiction no longer exists in the DSM, period. Everybody knows that, right? The DSM-5 no longer has the word addiction in it. So certainly sex addiction wasn't going to fly. So he looked at hypersexual disorder because he, being a doctor, thought, well, you get kind of hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism. You know, doctors all understand hyper and hypo, so we'll call it that. And quite honestly, I don't care what you call it. You can call it sexual compulsion, you can call it sexual addiction, you can call it hypersexuality. I don't care. I just know that I have this steady stream of people coming in with a pretty predictable pattern of symptoms and behavior that is causing a pretty particular pattern of consequences. And I also know that if you provide a certain kind of treatment, that behavior will dissipate, reduce, or be eliminated. So when people decide what they want to call it, you know, maybe I'll be on the planet, maybe Pat Carnes will be on the planet, I don't know. But we clearly have an issue. And by the way, the Committee for Sexual Disorders is, and parasexual disorders is very aware that there is a problem. They're very aware of the research. Why did it not make the DSM? It's politics, pure and simple. There is no political will within the APA to say that consensual sexual behavior can be problematic for some people. There's no one coming forward saying, we got to have that diagnosis. You know, it's just not an area that they want to dip their toes into, because if they do, then all the sexual offender people say, oh, well, that means all our offenders are just going to want to reduce their sentences by saying they're addicts, and they're absolutely right. Because if you look at Ariel Castro this summer, thank you, machine, for that. I know you're not paying attention to it, but I'm hearing that. Ariel Castro, the offender who perpetrated those women, and you know, he said in court, I'm a cold-blooded sex addict. Well, that made me really mad. I wrote like 4 blogs on that one, because I don't know whether you're a sex addict or not, but that's not addictive behavior. That's predatory offending. You know, very different. He looked at himself, and that is the fear of the offender community, that predators will say, oh, I'm just a sex addict. I just look at porn and masturbate, you know, and that they'll get off their sentence. So there's a lot of pressure from the offender community not to diagnose this. And at the other end are the sex therapy community, which comes out of the sexual liberalism of the 70s and 80s, which basically said we don't pathologize anybody's sexuality as long as it's consensual. So, you know, whatever people want to do is okay. And because homosexuality and fetishes and other alternative forms of sexuality were so heavily moralized and legally controlled in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and leading up to that time, there's a lot of issues with the idea of pathologizing sexuality when it could be considered healthy. So the APA has no interest in either end of the sexual continuum for people to have this diagnosis in the DSM, and we don't have one. There's a lot of other reasons for it, like insurance and drugs and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is I'm not sure when we're going to have a diagnosis, but I'm just going to keep treating people as they walk in and ask for help. The general public seems to have accepted this term, sex addiction. And by the way, whatever your beliefs are, I would strongly discourage you from talking someone out of the idea that they have the problem if they really do engage in compulsive and addictive sexuality, even if you don't believe in it. And the reason to not talk someone out of it is because it gives them hope. When you give someone a diagnosis and you tell them, if you go to meetings, if you do this, if you do that, you might get better, that gives them a lot of hope. And when you say, that doesn't exist, well then, what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean when you don't have a diagnosis? And in my mind, that's when you get moral judgment, that's when you get religious abuse, that's when you get misdiagnosis or misdiagnosis with medication. And I want you to remember what alcoholism was, those of you who are old enough to remember, because I remember watching TV in the 70s, or the late 60s, really, and I would sit with my dad, and we would watch TV, we'd all take Mannix and a Y50, and inevitably there'd be some alcoholic on television, you know, in the show. And what was an alcoholic? Alcoholic was a man lying in the gutter in a raincoat, unshaven, no job, no family, in the rain, with a bottle, passed out in the gutter. And my dad would look up at the TV and say, oh, well, that's a bum. Because that's what alcoholics were. Because there was no diagnosis for alcoholism up until, well, it was how many of you know what alcoholism was called in the DSM-1? Anybody know that? It was a personality disorder. Narcissism, borderline, alcoholism. So you can wonder why alcoholics don't like the mental health community very much. other than the fact that, you know, our physicians try to medicate them out of alcoholism with Librium and Valium and all those lovely drugs. We didn't really understand the issue, and fortunately we're living in a time now where these fields are coming together, but it wasn't always the case. So my folks, they're not bums, they're sleazy. They're nymphos, they're sluts, they're, you know, there's lots of names. And by the way, if you come from any particular religion and you think people should have sex in a particular way and they're not having it that way, you can say, well, you know, you're in our religion and you're not having sex in that way, you're looking at porn, you must be a sex addict. And who's to say that I'm wrong, because we don't have a diagnosis. So anybody can call anybody a sex addict, and anybody can call anybody hypersexual, and, you know, that's the reason for a diagnosis. It's not to rule a whole bunch of people in, it's actually to try to rule people out, in my mind. Here's a definition for addiction, the one that I tend to use the most. I think you probably have seen, but I'll read it. This is from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. These are the psychiatrists who are addiction trained, and they wrote this in 2011. They said addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and or relief by substance use and other behaviors. You will notice what I highlighted. This is the first time the medical community has said it isn't just substances. We understand that you can have an addictive relationship to gambling. You can have an addictive relationship to video gaming. You can have an addictive relationship to sexual behavior. And so while some parts of the field are going in this direction, other parts of the field are going in that direction. Thus it has ever been, because that's just humanity. And it's really a shame to me, because it would be nice if we could come together more succinctly, but maybe in time. Okay, I want to show you a little bit of film. And I'm going to show you two scenes from the same movie. Now, I don't have great sound, and it's a little bright in here. But make sure my speaker's lined up here. Hold on. Make my little speaker work. What I'm going to show you is two scenes from a movie called American Beauty. And let's see if I can make this work. And well, actually, you know what? I'm just going to, can I just show them to you silently? I might do that. Hold on one second. I'm trying to find, I know what I want. I think I will. I'm going to show you these scenes. I don't really think you need to hear the sound as much as I'd like to have it. Oh, I know what I can do. Well, okay. So these are two scenes from American Beauty that have music, which you're not going to hear. But there's no talking, so that's better. And the first scene is a scene that I think any family might find themselves in, and the second scene is very clearly something very different. And what I'd like to ask you to do is look for the differences in the two scenes, because I'm going to ask you questions about them. So here is the first scene. Oops, that was the first scene. Oh, my speaker's working. Look for the details. Okay, now I'm going to show you the same scene again, only slightly different, and I want you to look for the details. Okay. Now, I didn't show you the scene with the flowers coming out of her chest to be titillating. I showed it to you because it doesn't really happen. So, what are the differences between him in the first scene versus the second? What's different about him? Please excuse me, I'm going to try to plug in my speaker, but I am listening. I'm looking for hands. Difference? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so his focus is different in the second scene. How would you describe? How do you note that? I think you're right, but
Well, she's not in the front in the first scene, and in the second scene, she's the only one.
okay, but you talk about him.
Oh, yeah.
What's different about him? He's alone, so his family, everyone else is gone from his life. It's like that's the only thing he can see. It's tunnel vision. What else is different about him? Yeah.
He's fantasizing.
How do you know he's fantasizing? There's no sound.
Facial expression.
What are they?
His eyes.
His eyes get wider, his jaw kind of slackens, his head goes down. So there's clearly some kind of change going on in his neurobiology, right, that is causing him to be different. And everyone else is gone, and all he can focus on is this girl. And by the way, his daughter's out there dancing, but he's not focused on her. And what is going on with her that's different in this scene?
She's seductive.
She's dancing like a stripper. She's being seductive. Her skirt is shorter. What else is different about when you look at her? Pardon?
She's focused on him.
She's completely focused on him. And who do you think needs that to be the case? Him. And so this is all about him. This whole thing is about him. This is, you really got inside of his head. And what else is different about her?
She looks older.
She's alone. So even though his daughter's out there dancing and there's other, he went there to see his daughter, the only one he can see is her. And this would be very typical for a sex addict, where they go to a particular experience, or a drug addict for that matter, who goes to a party and says, I'd like to get high. And they're really looking for that person who's got the drugs, even though they might act like they're around other people being friendly and having a good time. Really, they're saying, I wonder who I can go out back and get high with. So there's that singular focus on what I want to go do and when I'm going to go do it and who it's going to be. And what happens when people have that kind of intense focus on arousal-based experiences? What happens inside of them? They start to get activated. So how could somebody be addicted to sex? I mean, it makes sense that you could be addicted to drugs, but how could you be addicted to sex? So we have to touch on the process addictions here. Let me start with a little story for you. I worked with a guy who was a crystal addict, and he would binge on crystal when he got paid every other week. And so a couple of weeks ago, his boss said, I'm going to get you an extra bonus check because you've been doing such a great job this summer. And the guy thought, man, I can get some drugs. This is awesome. When's that check coming? And all week he kept thinking about how great it was going to be. He called the dealer. The dealer said, yeah, I got some drugs. He said, I'm going to get this check Friday. Friday came. He went to the bank. He drove downtown. He cashed it. He went to the dealer's house. He parked in this special spot. He called his girlfriend, said, I'm going to be busy all weekend, cleared the space, went to the dealer's house, sat down. The dealer said, man, you're such a good drug addict and such a good customer. I'm going to give you a free hit. And he dropped a rock of crystal in a pipe, and the guy inhaled. Now, all of you can answer this question, I think, in probably the same way. At what point in the story is this man high? At what point in the story is he biologically and neurobiologically, is his state of consciousness altered, where he's not making good decisions for himself? He's thinking in a kind of laser-focused way, and he's lost his ability to have, to see the whole picture, if you will. I heard somebody say when? Yeah, I think when the boss calls and says, I got an extra check coming for you, and that's 4 days before he gets the drugs. And when he's driving down to the dealer's house, I could prove to you that he's in an altered state of consciousness, couldn't I? Because when he's in that car on the way to the dealer's house, I bet you his heart is pounding faster. I bet you his pupils are dilated. I would imagine his hearing is more acute. His breathing is more shallow. His hands would feel clammy and sweaty. He might have some sweat trickling under his arms. He wouldn't be thinking about work, girlfriend, what happened last time, the money that he needs. He is singular laser focused on getting there and getting the drugs. Anybody work with a drug addict who has had an experience like this? Okay, so one way to look at this is to say that you don't have to say they're high, but you can certainly say that their thinking is significantly altered by their fantasy arousal and their euphoric recall and all of that. And what I would like to say to you about the process addictions is that's what they're really about. It's not about the end point of the gambling or the sexual behavior. It's about losing myself in the neurobiological arousal of that rush or intensity. When I can completely bury myself in the excitement about who I'm going to do, what I'm going to do, where we're going to go, and I'm going to spend hours and hours and hours looking for it online, on my phone, just kind of put everything else aside except the singular focus for this. while I'm in that state of consciousness, I'm not really worried about the fight I'm having with my wife, our financial problems. I'm not thinking about that trauma trigger that came up when my boss yelled at me. You know, I'm not thinking about my kids and how am I going to, I'm not thinking about anything. You know, when a spouse says to me, I thought you loved me, why, how could you do these things? I think, well, when he was driving to see that prostitute, he really wasn't thinking about you at all. You know, he wasn't thinking about anything. The only thing that was in his mind was getting to that house and getting into that experience. And I think that allows us to have a way to talk about this because it is the neurochemical release that's driven by the idea of and the fantasy about sexual behavior that people are looking to lose themselves in, not the sex itself. You know, I don't know all of you, but I would guess that if you wanted to have a sexual experience from 0 to orgasm, that most of you could probably have one in about 10 or 15 minutes. I'm guessing, with the right stimulation. And so if sex addiction were about sex, why would someone spend 4 hours looking at porn? Why would someone spend 3 hours on their phone trying to find the right prostitute, the right person to hook up with, the right... what it is about is not the act itself, but it's about losing themselves in that whole run-up to the process. And they can do that for days or weeks. And remember, you know, even if I'm 3 days away from seeing my affair partner, every time I call them, every time I send them a text, my heart, you know, I get a little bit of a dopamine release, I get a little bit of adrenaline, I get a little bit of a rush of excitement. And in those moments, I'm really not thinking about or have to focus on the difficulties or challenges of my life. And, you know, we all do this. We all have healthy escapes. We all think about the weekend. We all think about seeing our families and friends. We all think about that date we've got on Friday night. We all have these same systems in place, just like we all might enjoy a glass of wine. It's just for some people, because of their early experiences, because of how they are wired, they are able to extend those experiences into long periods of losing themselves in the rush of adrenaline and dopamine release. And I would, one way to think about sex addiction or compulsive sexuality, I think, is to think about gambling addiction or a gambling disorder, because they're very, very similar. A lot of it is about the excitement, the fantasy, what it's going to be like. And you know, a gambler, they could have a stack of chips this high and have enough money to pay their kids' college fund back, pay their rent back. You know, they don't stop gambling because they won. They'll keep gambling until every chip is gone again, or they can build it back up, because what they're into it for is the next turn of the card, and the next turn, and maybe that next card, and maybe it's really the hijacking of that emotional part of us that wonders over what's over that next hill. And that's how someone can lose themselves in hours of porn, because why look at one image when there might be another one, and another one, and another one? And so, and with that comes the adrenaline, and the endorphins, and the dopamine, and the arousal, and suddenly I've spent 3 or 4 hours sitting in front of this computer or sitting and looking at my phone when I really should have been doing this, working on that, whatever. Now, I know that everyone here has had some experience like this, because anybody who's gone online to buy a plane ticket and spent 3 hours, you know, because you said, oh, I'll save $5 if I just go to Travelocity, then I'll go to Expedia, and then before you know it, by the way, the browser knows where you've gone, so every time you change sites, your price of your ticket goes up, just so you know that. So you need to clear your browser if you're searching for airline tickets online. I travel a lot, I know this. So does everyone understand what I just said? That was completely off the topic, but nonetheless. So, what is sex addiction? Well, it's this state of consciousness that the people I work with call being in the bubble, call being in the trance. They call it, they say things to me like, you know, I ended up at the adult bookstore, or my car kind of drove itself to her house, you know. And now I'm an addiction, I'm a cognitive behavioral addiction person. I understand that they made a decision, that they made choices, you know, we'll walk through all of that. But I also understand on some level, to them, it feels like they floated there. It feels like they kind of got there and they don't know how, because they are in that singular state of hyper-arousal that is really, if you take the pleasure part out, the dopaminergic part out, and just look at the adrenaline, it's fight or flight. You know, now, I don't know, do you have major disasters here? You have floods, right? Hurricanes and stuff like that? Okay, so I'm just guessing if the sky turned green and you heard a bunch of bells and you saw water kind of flowing over the lawn, and, you know, there were some rattling of wind and all the windows started cracking, your heart would start to pound, your pupils would dilate, your hearing would become more acute, you would perspire a little bit, and you probably wouldn't really be hearing what I had to say at all. You'd probably be thinking about maybe 1 or 2 things. One of them would be saving your butt, and where do I need to go to get to safety, and the other might be your family, because everything else would go out of your mind because of that adrenaline rush. And that is fight or flight, that's survival. You know, that's where we come from. I mean, the guy who walked out of a cave and saw a lion lying there and said, wow, that's really beautiful fur, and I love that color of their skin, and guess what happened to him? That's not our ancestor, you know. It's the guy who walked out and saw a little bit of fluff and a little bit of yellow, and before he knew it, even though he didn't know he knew how to, found himself up in a tree looking down at that lion. That's where we come from. And it's because that adrenaline rush can produce the ability to leave our prefrontal lobe, to leave the part of our brain that abstracts, that has clear perceptive thinking, and put us in a much more primitive part of our brain, and which is where the people that I work with act out from. They're not thinking. They're not thinking clearly. Do you think that you would, and by the way, that means that sex addiction is not about intelligence. There's this guy, he's an Oxford scholar, he was president of the United States, he had a history of philandering, he was being evaluated or legally charged, or I think Congress was looking into the possibility that he was harassing people in office, and during the course of that investigation, he was having sex with an intern in his office. Now that's not about intelligence. But if you happen to, anybody into genograms? Do Bill Clinton's genogram. You'll see all the elements of incestual parenting, incestuous parenting, caretaking parenting, alcoholism, abandonment by father. I mean, so many of the issues that I see in the men that I work with. And basically a man who grew up learning that if he learned how to take care of his mother, he would be okay. And that's what a lot of the men that I work with have learned. If they can read the signals and look externally to see what you need to be happy, then you will take care of me and you will make me happy. And they learn that really, really early. So there are attachment problems here. So sex addicts are universally externally focused. They're not internally focused. They don't say, what makes me, what is creative and recreational fun that I can enjoy? You know, when I ask my clients what do they do for a hobby, they look at porn. What do they do with their free time? They pick up prostitutes. You know, so the idea of an internally resourced sense of pleasure, recreation, and joy really is not very well developed inside of them. However, externally, they're very, very good at picking up. They can look at a room full of people like this, and I could probably, if I was in an active stage of my disorder, pretty quickly tell who I could probably get something going with, who I might get, whose focus I might get, who has some trauma issues that I might be able to plow right through, because they are hyper aware of what's going on with the other. And that is how they are so able to manipulate and seduce and also live a double life, because they can lie, you know, and act this way to please that person and then act this way to please that person, because the goal is to make sure that they get taken care of by making sure everyone else is okay. And that's really how their thinking works, because that's often how they were raised. So in 12-step language, there is a word for the state of consciousness where you're making decisions that are not good for you and you don't think you should be, and the word is powerless. That idea that I said I wasn't going to do it, I'm not going to go to that bookstore, I promised I wasn't going to masturbate a third time today to porn, I said I wasn't going to have unsafe sex 3 days after I got my HIV test, and yet here I am having unsafe sex again. You know, it's that idea that I said I wasn't going to do it, I keep doing it anyway. And it applies equally to sex addicts. So, sex addiction is not really about sex, if that helps you any, and it's not really about orgasm. It's about the search for sex and the desire for orgasm. It's about the whole process, just like it is for a gambler, just like it is for a compulsive overeater. It's the fantasies, the looking, the searching, the hunting, the whole hyper-neurobiological arousal state that I can put myself in when I start to intensely fantasize about and then act on sexual experience and sexual behavior. That's pretty much what my clients are struggling with. So where does it come from? Really quickly. And I mean really quickly, because we could spend a day on this. Sexual abuse, overt and covert. More overt in women. About 72% of the women we treat have overt sexual abuse in their history, and they are literally acting out what happened to them. Only this time they're winning. They feel a sense of control. You know, it's the woman who was molested at 13, learned she could, if she was seductive with her stepfather, she could control the time and the place. And so she learned seduction as a means of power and control. Even though she was in an out-of-control situation, she grew up thinking and believing she could have some control because she can control the time and the place. And then she ends up, you know, 15 years later standing on a stage stripping for 300 guys and feeling completely powerful and in control. And most of you ladies have asked you, wouldn't you mind just coming up here and stripping for a while? You probably would, the words power and control wouldn't come to mind. But for her, even though she had to have people escort her out to her car to keep her safe because she had money and she was beautiful, and she'd been stripping, and there were men in the parking lot who'd been watching her, she still felt when she was standing for all those men, she would say, I feel like I have them right here. You know, and guess what? Her heart is pounding, her adrenaline is pumping, her pupils are, she's in that arousal state when she goes up in front of all those guys and takes her clothes off. Early attachment deficits, social anxiety, social avoidance, any early experiences of not really learning how to deeply bond, make use of healthy social and relational experiences to feed myself, trauma, neglect, abuse. Parental enmeshment is a big thing that I was talking about earlier that I see a lot in the men, where men are asked to parent their mothers, or men are asked to or basically are only given the option to be loved when they are performing. I think Tiger Woods is a great example of that. Never met the man, haven't examined him, not assessed him, don't know whether he's a sex addict or not, but I do know in his story, you know, and he tells it very clearly, that his father wouldn't talk to him or engage with him unless he was playing a good game of golf. And so what does that say to that child, except unless you're performing and pleasing me, you're not worthy of love. You know, and that child will learn that lesson pretty quickly, because children are pretty smart. And you don't stand out here and say, love me, love me, love me, and not get back what you need for very long if you're a smart kid. You know, if you're a smart kid, you say, I get the problem. Problem is me. Problem is I have all these needs. Problem is that I am trying to get these people to be there for me, and they're not the problem. The problem is that I'm needy. You know, and that to me is almost any addict I've ever met. Needless, wantless, you know, 800-pound telephone, don't reach out to other people, because they've learned to handle it on their own, to do it themselves, and to not make themselves vulnerable to the possibility that someone might let them down or hurt them. And I got to tell you, when you're picking up a prostitute or looking at porn or having an intense affair, you don't have to worry about being disappointed or let down or wounded. You know, because those are controllable situations where you can pretty universally expect that you're going to be adored, appreciated, and you can manage and be in control of the situation. So my clients will go downtown in a brand new car at 3 in the morning to the worst part of town and invite a prostitute and her pimp into the car and feel perfectly safe and in control, because their heart is pounding and their pupils are dying and they're in that state of it. But all of us would look at them and say, they look totally crazy. I mean, what are they doing? What's wrong with them? I mean, they just lost their congressional seat. Why would they still be, you know? Well, if you're an addict, you don't think about those things. You know, you're just thinking about having the thing that you want to have. And it feels very powerful and very exciting, and you feel like you have it all together, especially if you can make it home by 4 in the morning and your wife never knew you left. Then you really feel powerful. So, parental enmeshment, pre-existing and untreated character pathology. I've been doing this work for 22 years. I have probably seen, I don't know, maybe half a dozen full-blown personality disorders in 22 years, and I've treated easily 1,000 people. In different residential centers and in private practice and group work and all that stuff. I see strong narcissistic wounding. I see some borderline traits in the women. Some of the women we see more full-blown, what you would call borderline. Occasionally I see a borderline male. But most of all, what I see is people who are desperate to have their emotional needs met, but unable, incapable, or unwilling to meet other people in a vulnerable, open way to get those needs met. Again, I can be married, I can have a relationship, it's just you don't really know me, and you don't really know what I'm doing over there. So I'm who you want to be because that's what I want you to think I am, but I'm going to be this over here, and they're very used to living that kind of life. All of these things, and I want to say something about this too, like, it's not unusual for me to run into trauma people who will say, oh yeah, sex addiction, that's about trauma. And I'll run into people who are focused on attachment, and they'll say, oh, that's an attachment disorder. And then I'll run into other people who say, oh, well, clearly it evolves out of some kind of abuse or narcissistic parenting or a social deficit. And you know what? They're all right. Because it isn't so much about where it comes from, it's about where the person ends up. It's that they end up being unable or unwilling to utilize basic intimacy, socialization, and support to meet their healthy dependency needs. Doesn't mean they're not in relationships. It's just they're not fully in relationships. They're only in relationships as much as they want to let you in and be in relationship with you, because they're managing and controlling and distancing and leveraging because they're trying to protect themselves. I mean, that's really what's going on underneath. Sex addicts seek intensity versus intimacy is the term we use, because most of us, when we have a bad day, you know, we seek to down-regulate. I mean, that's the goal, right? You have a really stressful day and you're going to go for a walk, you're going to talk to a friend, you're going to take a bath, you're going to exercise, you know, hopefully if you're reasonably healthy, you might even plop in front of the TV just to drain out. But that's not what my clients do. They want to go that way. You know, they have a bad day and they want to do something really exciting, really intense. That's going to, so rather than de-escalating their anxiety, their stress levels, they escalate their anxiety and their stress levels because that's how they self-soothe. They self-soothe through escalation rather than de-escalation, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but then all of this is kind of counterintuitive until you get underneath it. Let me take questions for just a couple of minutes about sex addiction and what I've sort of poured out for you. I did, by the way, let me just say this, give you a 25-question questionnaire that you're welcome to use with anyone that you like. And it's there simply because if you have somebody that you think might have a problem with this, give them the questionnaire. Because then they can, you know, then you have a resource. Thank you, I'll give that back to you. And you may not feel comfortable saying something to them like, have you ever had sex with someone that left you feeling disgusted about what you just did? You may not feel comfortable asking them that, but this will. And you know, people will more accurately respond to paper than they do to face-to-face interaction. So people will check things off here that they won't necessarily tell you. And then it's real easy to go back as a clinician and say, you know, I'm wondering about this. You know, it says that you checked you were arrested. Tell me more about that. Or your parents had romantic problems. What was that? Or you say you feel preoccupied or distracted by sexual thoughts. Tell me about that. You know, so this gives you a springboard, if you will, to ask some of the questions. And I hate to sound like an old fogey, but I will. In this day and age, there, I've said it. Those are the words my grandmother used to use. In this day and age, someone comes into you for infidelity, it is never simple. You know, if you hear about one thing, there are 10 other things going on. You know, it's just the way of the world. There are so many opportunities. If someone is someone who's engaging in a lot of extramarital, a lot of extra relationship, a lot of anonymous behavior, there's probably a lot more. I figure clients tell me about 30% of what the truth is when the first time I meet them, and then I might get up to 50% within a few weeks, and if I'm lucky, we get the whole story by the time they end treatment. Now, in the time that I have, which is about 50 minutes, yes, question? You don't ask to go, you go to the bathroom or get coffee. There's a couple other topics I can talk about. I want to talk about treatment a little bit so you can get a sense of what that is. I also have a section here on betrayed spouses, which I think is a really important population to talk about because they don't get very much attention. And I'm also very interested in talking about technology, and I'm not sure I'm going to get through all of them. So my goal, I think, is I'm going to start with spouses because I think that's really important. And we'll see if we get to tech before we get to treatment. I don't have a lot of time to talk about them, but I will tell you this. I have worked with men and women whose spouses have betrayed them hundreds of times sexually. We're not talking about an affair or, I'm talking about, repeated patterns of problem behavior outside of a primary relationship for 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, 20 years. Oftentimes the spouses have little idea or they know about a few things, but they've been told not to worry about it or it'll never happen again or it was just this little thing or it's what my dad did or whatever it is. And by the way, I really hate this expression, the wife should have known or the husband should have known. Or it makes sense to me that if you're the closest person to someone and you are very dependent on them in a healthy way, that you would be the last person to know that they would be hurting you. You wouldn't assume, your neighbor across the street might easily see that your husband is flirting or your wife is flirting with other people, but you wouldn't necessarily see because why would you want to see that? You would protect and defend your image and your experience of your relationship. So the idea that the wife is always the last to know, if you will, makes perfect sense to me because they would be. And what happens often with the people that I work with is that the spouses find out a fairly large amount of information they didn't know about fairly quickly. And what happens to them is they get traumatized by that. And has anyone worked with a betrayed spouse? Okay, is this a fun population? No. We're mental health professionals, and who likes crazy, angry people in your office? One of the reasons why I like working with addicts, they tend to be fairly compliant, fairly contrite, and they just want to make themselves, deal with the problem and have everything go away. Spouses, however, are not quite like that. Spouses are angry, they're unpredictable, they're chaotic, they're filled with rage. One day they hate him, the next day they love him. They want to be in treatment. They want to have him be as far away from you as possible. They want to have sex with him every day. They never want to touch him again, and they're going through his wallet, going through his, going through his history on his computer, all of that. And you would say, oh my God, that's a crazy person. And for many years, by the way, in my field, we did. We said, oh, we have all these narcissistic men. They clearly have married borderline women, and thus is the relationship. And what we didn't really realize was And it took the wives and the spouses to teach us this, because most of the leaders in my field were sex addicts who went into the field or were in the field, like Pat Carnes, or myself, or Mark Glazer, or all the various people in the field. What we didn't have was a lot of spouses, and we didn't understand our spouses any better than anyone else did. So it took them to teach us that they're really not crazy. What they're going through is trauma. That experiencing profound betrayal by someone that you are basing your future on is a form of betrayal. And when you find out that it isn't just a little bit of betrayal, but they've been lying to you consistently over many, many years, that's very overwhelming for spouses. And so what happens to them is that they kind of go crazy. They actually go crazy over time, and this is something that I think is important to think about as anyone who treats addiction. I'm not a big fan of the codependency model, so I just want to put that out there. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but I just think we are too quick to judge spouses. If you're someone who's living with someone who lies to you all the time, who manipulates your reality, and you say, I thought you were going home at 8, and how trust is. You can't partialize it. So if you're in the relationship with someone who's broken your trust, they've broken your trust. You will never look at them in the same way. You have a coworker who's stealing from you, you find somebody going through purses or lockers, you might find out that their husband lost their job and their kids are in desperate straits, and you may feel terrible for them, and you may let them keep their job and support them. But if you walk in late one night and find them going through lockers, you're going to be thinking, boy, I wonder if they're at it again. You'll never look at them in the same way. And we think of, the most common way of thinking of trust, I think is trust is like a plate. When you break it, you can put it back together and you can use it again, but that crack is going to be there. So these relationships are never the same. I can never look at you again and say, I'm married to you, and I know that you, because I'm married to you, would never deliberately go out and do something that you know would hurt me. And now I know that you've gone out and hundreds of times done things that you know would hurt me. So I'll never look at you in the same way again, because now I know that you can go hurt me and not think twice about it, which is true. And by the way, most of the relationships I work with stay together, because these people have a lot more going on than simply sex. At least in the first year and a half to 2 years, about 80% of the couples that we work with stay together. The ones that don't are usually ones who've only been married a very short period of time or only together a very short period of time. And the spouse who's been lied to says, wait a minute, you could have told me about all this before we got married or before we got in this relationship. You didn't tell me, and I've only been here 2 years. Maybe I don't need to stay here. But by the time you've got family, kids, church, community, house, tax, it gets a lot harder, and you're more deeply attached over the years. A lot of the spouses stay. And by the way, when you have a profoundly betrayed spouse who comes into your office if you work outpatient, they're most of the time not looking to go to you to say, how do I get out of this relationship? They're mostly coming in to say, how do I stay in this relationship? Or what just happened to me? They're in shock in the early stage. Yes, ma'am. I'll repeat her question. Sorry.
Do you think this pattern emerges, which on the face of it is a little surprising, because A, the addict really is contrite and wants to hold on, or B, that is true, and the partner was originally selected as somebody who was likely to stay the course and be loyal anyway?
Well, I'll answer her question. I'll reframe her question and answer a different one, but I think it'll help you. It's sort of like speaking to codependency. There's this idea that, if I was raised in a certain way and I've had certain experiences, that's who I'm going to kind of mold with, bond with, repetition, compulsion, all that stuff, and then I'll play that stuff out in my adult relationship. I don't know that that's always true. Sex addicts are very charming. They're very engaging. They're very laser focused on the person they're with. I can see a younger person getting in a relationship with someone who is reasonably healthy. But that person is being seduced and they don't know it. And then they're in the marriage or the relationship, but that's the only one that they've really had. And then, they have kids and they don't really know that that person could be closer because they haven't had kids with another person before. So a healthy person might find themselves over time in a situation that is very, very dysfunctional, not because they grew up in one, but because that's what they evolved themselves into. And then someone else might have a history of this kind of abandonment, attachment problems in childhood, and look for someone who doesn't threaten them emotionally, who they, on some level they can already feel is going to distance themselves. So, I think it's case by case. I don't think there's any general way that, and I'm not sure that's really what your question was, but I was trying to address it in a broader way. You want to try one more time, and I'll try one more time? Okay. Any other questions, as long as we're trying for questions? You asked about, now that's going to bug me. You asked about sincerity and being contrite. When those people walk in the office at that moment, your question is, was she always crazy, and was he always contrite? Is that possible?
No, I wasn't asking was she always crazy.
Looking crazy, right.
My question was, you suggest that typically the addict really wants to keep the partner.
They want to keep their partners.
They don't want to be abandoned.
That is correct.
Or rejected.
That is true.
So they're willing to work, at least on the surface, and if it gets badly enough, they're probably willing to do something more fundamental.
That is correct.
To enable that.
That is correct.
And then my other question, the second question was, had they originally chosen that partner with a sense, this is not a person who would easily walk out, this is a person who's given to loyalty, commitment,
Right.
support.
I would say, I don't want to make a universal statement. I don't have research behind it, but my experience says that sex addicts will often choose partners that are less likely to abandon them, because they are looking for that edge that will keep the person around. And it may not be that they know they're going to give the person reason to want to leave them. They may not know that they're going to be acting out, but they have an underlying fear of that abandonment, so they're going to do. And by the way, I will devalue my spouse, put my spouse down, say how fat they are, how unattractive they are, how unpleasant they are, so I can go out and justify my behavior. But have that spouse move 1 inch away from me, and I'm going to, oh my God, what do I need to do to make sure that, all my, because it's not that I'm not attached, it's more that I'm unaware of my attachment. And I think that's something that we don't think about a lot, is that some children grow up, it's not that they're not attached, but it's really important for them to not know consciously of their attachment. So they feel the attachment, they're connected, but that person doing those scary things or those uncomfortable things or those overwhelming things, that has nothing to do with my deep love for my parents. So they can be attached. So I can be very attached to you and then devalue you, dismiss you, go act out all over the place, not see how it's going to affect you, go back into the relationship, and even say to you, I don't understand why you're so angry. I told you all about it, which I see addicts do a lot. Just I'll spell everything out to you, and then you're going to forgive me, right? Because, and within 5 minutes. By the way, I meant to, let's talk a little bit more about spouses. So my experience is that it is not so much the lying, the sexing, the drugs, and all of that is really the greatest wounding to the spouse. It's the betrayal. It's the fact that I can no longer trust you, that I thought I knew who I was living with. And spouses will say things like, I don't know if anything we've ever had in the past is true. I don't know if anything we have together now is true. I can't imagine that anything going forward is going to be true because I don't trust you. And trust, just like basic trust when we're children, is a very early and probably the most profound piece of a primary relationship. If you don't have trust, I'm not sure you have a relationship or much of one. And so these spouses are really questioning, how can I be with you when you come home and I don't know what's been going on? And that's when they start acting crazy. Because you've been in recovery for 6 months and you come home 10 minutes late when you said you were going home at 6. And I remember what you used to be doing when you were coming home 10 minutes late. And that's the hypervigilance trauma piece. And so by the time you're 10 minutes late and you walk in with arms full of groceries because you were trying to please me, I'm furious. And you're like, well, but I bought the groceries and I waited in line and I did everything. And I'm thinking, yeah, but you're 10 minutes late. And I know what you're doing when you're 10 minutes late. And it doesn't matter that it's been a year or 6 months because, you don't get to be 10 minutes late. And that's where they're coming from. They are angry and they are looking for reasons to go back into that high anxiety trauma state of mistrust. So what is the emotional state of a betrayed spouse? Well, it looks like it's a form of trauma, and it looks like this. They're fearful of further loss and abandonment. They're ashamed. And if it's a woman, the culture has those messages for women. You should be able to keep your man around. If your man's fooling around, it must be your fault. So they're already internalizing. Plus, if it's a man and he's looking at a lot of online porn and all those perfect images, she's thinking, well, I could never be like that. I can never have sex with, how am I supposed to compare to that? So there's a lot of self-doubt. So spouses are ashamed, remorseful, they're self-doubting. They often, you may tell your priest or your doctor that your husband is drinking. You will not necessarily tell him that you found 400 images of porn and a whole lot of connections to prostitutes on the computer. You may not tell your sister that, your mother that, your neighbor that. Who are you going to tell that to? So spouses are often very isolated. They're anxious, they're hypervigilant, they're easily triggered to previous levels of the trauma. They're worried about the future, they're worried about parenting, they're worried about finances, they're worried about separation. They have intrusive thoughts, they have images. I had a wife who would, her husband, about 6 months into treatment, and he was sleeping soundly because he was working a program, and he had, talked about his, no longer was carrying that shame, and he'd gone through his history, and so he was sleeping pretty soundly, and she was just overwhelmed with what had happened to her a few months into it. And so he would lie there snoring, and she would just ruminate about how he'd ruined her life, and now he couldn't trust her anymore, and he gave her herpes, and whatever. And so she would end up turning him and hitting him, waking him up because she was so mad at him. And so one of the things we do have to work on with spouses is boundaries, by the way. I heard that giggle over there. This is not a suggestion. Don't go home and hit your spouse while they're sleeping. But is that person borderline? Do they have a personality disorder? Is that woman or man, what is going on with them psychologically? And what I would say to you about that is you're not going to be able to determine that probably for about a year. Because that person, I'll answer your question in a second, that person's going to be in that state of trauma for a long time. I'll give you a quick example. I had a couple that was working together. They were doing very, very well. They'd been in couples therapy. They were each seeing somebody. He was going to meetings. She was in a support group. They were doing great. 6 months they decided they would go up to a cabin. They dropped their kids off. Therapists all approved. And they went up to this little cabin for a weekend, and they cooked together. They had this great weekend together, and they made love for the first time in 6 months, and she was feeling really hopeful. And they were driving, and this is a true story, by the way. They were driving down the hill, and at the end of their lovely weekend, and she turned and saw a Victoria's Secret billboard. And in her mind, she thought, that motherfucker. Those are the guys those are the kind of women he was with. That's how he ruined my life. That's just exactly. And so she turned to her husband while they were driving after this wonderful weekend and said, I hate you. I can't believe that I'm sitting here with you. I don't know what I was thinking going up to the mountain with you and why I ever had sex with you. I must be crazy. And he's thinking, yeah, I think you are crazy. Because, they have this wonderful weekend and everything was fine, but and so in that moment, does she look like a crazy person? Absolutely. But if you look at the bigger picture, and her hypervigilance, what she saw was a reminder of what caused her the most pain. And it isn't those breasts with a feathery bra. That's not what caused her pain. It's the fact that she trusted him again. That she let herself go away with him and be vulnerable, and now she's feeling close to him, and she knows that's when she gets hurt. So she's reminded of that. It's a trigger as much as a helicopter going overhead might be for an Iraq veteran. It is a trigger for her to rage and fear, and then she goes back into that state. Now, it may not last as long as it did 6 months before, but she's going to be back and that is normal for my spouses. Up to a year, they can be raging, searching, hunting, and we're very quick to pathologize them. So that was all I want to put out there about the spouses, is that they need time to grieve. They need time. So what don't they need? What does a betrayed spouse of an addict, especially a sex addict, not need? They don't need to be calmed down. They're not going to like that too much. I wouldn't try it. You won't see them again. They don't need to look at their part. If your child was hit by a truck and they were in the hospital in a coma and you didn't know if they were going to make it or not, and then you went into a therapist and they said, tell me what your parents' relationship was like growing up. What kind of therapist would that be? A bad one. So your entire relationship is hanging on the rocks. You just found out about 3 affairs and hundreds of contacts with prostitutes. You don't know whether to stay or leave. You're not even sure of the state of your finances or if your kids might be involved or the babysitter. And you walk into the therapist and they say, well, tell me about your sexual life that your parents had, or tell me about how you and your husband are getting along sexually. What does that have to do with anything? So these spouses don't do well. In fact, and I would say the spouses of all addicts do not do well if you ask them to look at their part in the beginning. They really have been victimized by their experience, whether they chose to be there or not. You look at it however you want. They need the opportunity to vent. So they don't need, and I'm talking about in the first 9 months. They don't need exploration of their past or family history. They don't need exploration of their sexual or romantic life with their spouse. They don't need labels like codependency or any implication that there's something wrong with them. They don't need to be diagnosed while they're in crisis. And if you do these things, they'll leave. It's hard enough to keep spouses in treatment, but these are the kinds of things that drive spouses out of treatment in my experience. And this can be up to a year or more, and this is an honest truth. I had a woman walk up to me, I was giving a lecture like this. A woman came in, I didn't know there was general public there, it was fine. She heard the lecture, she came up to me, she had been in treatment at our clinic with her husband, and she came up to me and she said, I don't know if you remember me, but I spent about 2 years at the clinic and we did individual work on couples, all this stuff. And she said, things are really starting to get better 2 years later. And I said to her, great, tell me how you're doing. And she said, well, I'm beginning to think that maybe I chose him for the wrong reasons. Maybe there were things going on when we were dating 18 years ago that I didn't see. And I'm thinking, this is this woman talking, maybe it has something to do with how I grew up. This is 2 years later. Had I brought this up to her at 9 months, 6 months, 18 months, I never would have seen her again. She's just beginning because she's not doing this. She's at the point now where she's done, but she has to do this for a while. So what are the clinical needs of these spouses? They need concrete direction. They're in crisis. They need direction around self-care, health issues, talking to family. They need education about addiction, about disclosure, about family dynamics. They need holding and validation of their reality. They need disclosure, and disclosure is something in my field that we do when there have been a tremendous number of secrets and lies over a long period of time. If a couple is going to stay together, at some point we expect that the other partners get to hear about what has gone on that they didn't know about if they want to hear about it. We don't really believe that relationships can go forward with a great deal of lying and secrecy. You can't rebuild a new relationship on a lot of lies and secrecy, and that spouse really wants to know oftentimes what's happened. And we feel they have a right to know, but we're not going to tell them unless they're safe, they're in therapy, they've got support and all that kind of stuff. Spouses need social support. You know, that woman who feels like she's too overweight, too unattractive, not smart enough, and really it is her fault. And she looks across a betrayed spouses group, which is a wonderful group to have, by the way, amazingly powerful for those men and women who do them, who sit in those groups, who deal with those groups. But sitting in a group of betrayed women, and a woman is feeling inadequate, and she looks across the room and she sees a very attractive, very intelligent woman who's also been betrayed over and over and over again, and she thinks, well, maybe it isn't just me, maybe, you know, this happens to other people too. It's very, just like addicts do best in group, so do betrayed spouses. They do really well in group, and then they can all get together and hate their spouse together. And then they go home and they're not to the same degree taking it out on the person that they're in a relationship with. Yes, you had a question.
When you're working with women, I found it very useful to just call it emotional abuse, and they hold on.
It is emotional abuse.
They hold on to that. It's a very helpful phrase.
Yeah, lies, manipulation.
People are educated now about physical abuse and so on.
Right.
That is really important.
I really appreciate that. And then we just take it to the next level, which is says that someone who's experienced a long period of emotional abuse has been traumatized. And so what are the results of that trauma? Well, they may look like this. And that's very validating to that person because you're not saying to them that it's their fault. You're saying something happened to them. And it may well be, by the way, that they're borderline and that they're crazy and that they're codependent, you know, but in the beginning, you're just not going to know that. So, okay. So I think, as much as I want to talk about tech, that I think I really want to talk about treatment because we're not going to have a lot of time. However, I have a lot of, I do want to say maybe one or two words about technology for the moment. What's happened over the last 25 years, I just want to say for those of you not aware of it, we live in a different world. Our world has changed beyond, we're going to move into, I don't know what page number it is, but wherever it says toward the back about treatment, that's where we're going to look at. We're living in a very, very different world than the one that most of us grew up in. How many people in the room are under the age of 25? Can you raise your hand? Because there's no one in this room under the age of 25, so no one in this room is a digital native. Everyone in this room grew up having to adapt to or learn about computers and the digital world. It's assumed that people under 25 are considered to be digital natives, meaning they grew up with Mario Brothers and they grew up with those games and they grew up with computers and maybe a little early laptop. Actually, the truth is I believe that real digital natives are only about 5 or 6 years old right now. So because the 1-year-olds who are getting the iPads and it's in their hands at that early stage. So there's a few things I just want to say to you about tech that I'm just really fascinate me, and I have 5 minutes to give you. One is we're experiencing, I think for the first time, the opportunity to see human evolution in front of us. We have never, as a species, been able to witness human evolution occur in front of our eyes before. But when you hand that instrument to a 1.5-year-old who doesn't really even know the language, and they become able to do this, their neurobiological development is changing. And who these kids are who are doing this all day long from an early age are going to be very different people. Their prefrontal lobe is developing differently than ours. They're going to be different people. They may be more superficial, but have a lot broader knowledge. They may know not as many people deeply, but know more people. They may be able to multitask, which, by the way, none of you can, and I can't either. There's lots of research. Multitasking is not possible for us. We're not able to do it, even though we think we can. When we take on 2 or 3 things, we usually end up slowing down one and screwing up the other. So that's just how we are. But I would guess that it may well be that these 3, 4, 5-year-olds, when they're 20 or 30, they may be able to multitask because they started doing it at 3 years old and 2 years old. So one of the things I want to tell you is we are experiencing a great period of evolution that is being driven directly by technology. And it's not only what we're putting into our kids' hands, it also involves human sexuality in a very profound way, because I can now find a sexual partner as easy as I can find an Italian restaurant with my phone. I simply pull up a sex app, and I look for someone within 300 feet, 500 feet, 700 feet, 1,000 feet who's online looking for sex, and I click and I start texting them, and within 15 minutes, we're having sex. And that's true for straight people, that's true for gay people. Anonymous, casual sex is now available through your phone 24/7 anywhere in the world. And you can usually pretty much find somebody looking for sex within even in a rural area within 30 miles. So the skill set that it took to evolve sexuality to get someone to be sexual with you is no longer needed for someone to be sexual. I don't have to necessarily know how to date someone, go out with them, flirt with them, put my arm around them, learn what's too much, what's too little, because I can have sex without doing any of that. And I have guys coming into the clinic now who have been looking at hardcore porn since they were 15. They're now 25, and they say, I'd like to learn how to date. Or I want to learn how to be sexual with a partner because all I've done is be sexual online and maybe picked up and had a few casual experiences. Well, dating is going to be a long way off because that person has been using hyperstimulation over and over and over again to perfect images, an endless number, for their entire, since puberty. So how are they then going to turn to a relational experience that involves intimacy, connection, emotion, when they've been looking at three-minute money shots for 15 years. So for some people, it's going to be a very hard transition. The government of Japan, I love this survey, so I have to quote it. The government of Japan did a survey in 2011 and 2012. Japan is concerned they have a declining population. They don't have enough babies being born. So they wanted to, and they have an aging population. So they wanted to ask their younger people, why aren't we having more babies? So they went and they interviewed 2,500 men between the ages of 19 and 25, which is our sexual peak, by the way. And they asked them a whole bunch of questions. But one of the questions they asked these men is, are you interested in having relational sexuality? Are you interested in being sexual with a person? And 22% of these 2,500 men in both surveys said, no, I'm not interested in having relational sex. 22% of men in the prime of their sexual peak said they're not interested in having sex with a person. And when asked why, the answer is, it's too much trouble. You have to deal with people's moods. They smell funny. Sometimes they don't want to have sex with you. Why? I've got anime, I've got porn, I've got vibrate, I've got all. Why would I want to deal with a person? And by the way, that is also human evolution, because the people who may not reproduce because they would choose a computer or a virtual experience over an in vivo experience, and there are people who will choose those, they may not reproduce, which is also part of evolution. So you have some people who are becoming more attracted to machines than people. You have machines that have vibrators built into them that are also internet driven so that you can masturbate to them or put them inside of you. We have body suits that now you can put on and you can feel someone touching you from thousands of miles away, whether you know them or you don't. You can feel them touching your genitals. You can feel them touching your body. Anybody ever been in a massage chair? Okay, well, it's kind of like that. You can feel someone's touch, only they're 3,000 miles away in a computer doing this. So our whole notions of what intimacy is, what relationship is, what infidelity is, these are all changing, shifting notions that we have held since the dawn of time. But I'll tell you what, most people over 30 have a very clear definition of what a relationship is, and it has something to do with meeting someone. I bet you there's a lot of younger people who would disagree strongly. They would tell you that having a relationship doesn't necessarily mean meeting the person at all. I have a really good friend, one of your colleagues actually, who has a daughter who's 16, Nancy in Arizona. And she was at the mall with her 16-year-old, and they were going up the escalator together. And her daughter said, oh, look, there's, Susie something or other. And, she's into knitting and so, whatever she's into. And, I think she's in the band club. And the two of us, we've, been talking about going to practice together, whatever it is. And her mom said, oh, you must know each other well. And she said, no, we've never met. But we exchanged Facebooks a lot, and I'm always reading her Facebook page, and we're always, now that girl would never say that she didn't have a relationship with that other person, but a lot of older people would. And my question to you is, who's right and who's wrong? When I sit at a table full of 35 and 45 and 55 and 65-year-olds, and there's a few 20 and 30-year-olds at the other end texting and tweeting and talking, and what are the older people doing at my end of the table? Clucking. Oh, look at those younger people. They're so disconnected. They're all on their computers. We're sitting right here. How rude are they? Blah, blah, blah. And I just think, well, why are we right and why are they wrong? Because if you put a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds at a table, they're texting and tweeting and talking and interacting, and nobody seems to care. So maybe it has something to do with being older. Maybe it has something to do with an older generation that is struggling with the new morality, the new experiences, the new exposure that younger people are having to things that we created by bringing these technologies to them. My parents said that sex, drugs, and rock and roll was going to destroy my generation. And my parents dated in their living room with my grandmother in the kitchen listening to see if there was any smooching going on. And then they had to go on double dates because they weren't allowed to go on single dates, because if you were with another couple, then they figured nothing bad was happening. So by the time I was I wasn't dating, by the time I was actively sexual in the 70s, we were playing spin the bottle and smoking pot in the basement. My parents didn't come anywhere near there. And my parents said, oh my God, look what those kids are doing with sex, and look what's going to happen, all that free love and blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what I hear now? Oh my God, look at all that pornography, and kids aren't looking at sex in the same way, and they're not being intimate, and they're all going to become, they're not going to develop mirror neurons because they're all looking into their machines instead of people's eyes. And I just think, really, what a bunch of hogwash. I mean, I'm sorry, older folks, but I just think we're experiencing another turn of the generational wheel. And older people are, we're scared. We don't know all that stuff. We're not familiar with it all. And we do what every generation does that has gone before us, which is we devalue it. We dismiss it. We say there's something wrong with it. It's going to hurt them. Because deep down, I think we have a lot of fear that we're going to get left behind, or we're not going to be able to keep up, or maybe ultimately who will take care of us if those people are all involved in that world and we raise them. There's a lot of stuff that goes on generationally that we look in the moment and we say, look at that new technology. That's the problem. I have a book coming out about this in the fall, and I can tell you, look at what people said about telephones. They said they were going to ruin humanity. They said that people would never have a reason to be in face-to-face contact now that they had telephones. What they said about television. When I was growing up in the 70s, some of you may remember this, television was the great evil. This is one of my favorite examples of this, actually. When I was growing up, they said television was ruining family life because no one was talking, and families were coming together and sitting in front of this box, but not interacting. And do you know what people are saying now? They're saying, oh, things were so much better when the family would come together and watch TV, and then they had something to talk about, but now everybody's in their own separate world and they're not connecting. And I think, sounds really similar to me. I remember when violence on television was being, there were congressional investigations into violence on television because it was going to produce a more violent culture back in the 70s. We have a 30% less violence in our cities than we had 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Now they're looking at video games and saying, oh, that's going to produce a more, I just don't. So we have our fears that we latch onto. So here's a thought for you about future generations before I get into treatment issues around sex addiction. There will always be people who are going to fall through the cracks, and they're going to fall through the cracks faster and in increasing numbers because technology has created, we have created experiences and substances they can have more immediate access to that are more intense. What was a cocoa leaf compared to refined cocaine? What was wine and beer compared to distilled alcohol? What is what you find in a gas station now? Go into a 7-Eleven and to pay for your gas, or a gas station now, and what do you find? A room full of food. 30 years ago, you found gas, oil, cigarettes, a guy in a greasy overalls. So our ability to cheaply manufacture and distribute in mass quantities, low nutrition, high sugar, high caloric content food has, we have an obesity problem, big surprise. So technology always drives certain kinds of behavioral and substance addictions as we refine pleasure and make it more accessible. The question is not, are people going to have problems with it? Sure. The question is simply, what kind of solutions are we going to involve, as we always do, to help the people who fall through the cracks? There will always be drug addicts. There will always be sex addicts. It's just, and there will always be people who are struggling with whatever new technology comes along. And there'll be those of us, like those of us in the room, who figure out the new solutions to help those people. So this is my little caveat, my little plug for, don't worry so much. If your kid is screwed up, they're going to be screwed up, whether they have porn or not. I worked with a therapist. I'll just say this. I was talking to a therapist recently who said to me, she said, I'm not sure if the technology is the problem or not, but I have this young couple that I'm working with, and they're in their late 20s, and they yell at each other across the house. Like, they don't actually yell at each other. They text each other in caps, I'm really mad at you. Well, I'm mad at you, so like that. And so they came into her therapy office, and they were sitting on either end of the couch with their phones, one in each hand. And she said, I wasn't sure how much the technology was driving the problem. And I said to her, well, if you took the phones out of their hands, where would they be sitting? Because people who are emotionally connected are going to be sitting next to each other with phones or without phones. So the technology we may see the expression of the problem in the technology, but the problem is not the technology, the problem is us, as it has always been. The challenges that we have will get expressed into our new technology. So Does this mean you should be handing porn over your 3-year-old? No, I don't think that's a good idea. We should be educating our children about sex. Why? Why is it more important now than ever to educate children at a young age about human sexuality in a healthy way, in an age-appropriate way? Why now?
Because they can get it on the internet.
And what are they getting on the internet? They're getting things that don't look anything like intimacy, anything like relationship, anything like foreplay. They're seeing a 3-minute intense, So simply to educate them that what they're seeing isn't real life is really, because it's, and let me tell you folks, those of us who say, those of cluckers in the audience, any cluckers about, let me just say, this isn't going away. You can cluck all you want, you can worry all you want, you can stay off Twitter and stay off Facebook and be technologically unsound if you choose. But this isn't going away. And by the way, those people whose world is social media and all that stuff, they're going to be your clients 10 years from now. And if you don't speak their language, they're going to figure you don't understand them. Then there are clients now. How many people in the room don't have a smartphone? Please raise your hand, be honest. How many people don't have a smartphone? Okay, keep your hands up, hold on 1 second. You need to get one. This is not optional. Well, let me say this. It's optional, of course you can't afford it. It's optional if you want to be what I would call an old fogey, which means you are afraid of you're afraid of, well, I don't even want to say that. You're more invested in the past than the future. How about that? So if you want to be the person driving by in a Model T with no windows going wonk wonk, and everyone going, oh, what a cute old car. I remember they had those in museums. Have an old cell phone. If you want to be in this century, you need to have a new one because that's where the world is. That's where everybody else is. And the further you get away from that, the more fear-based you are around technology, the less likely it is you're going to involve yourself, and the further away you're going to get from younger people. And younger people is how we stay connected to life. So anyway, I just really discourage judgment and encourage sort of a neutral view of a new world that is emerging that is unfamiliar and uncomfortable for us, but that doesn't mean that it's bad and it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just different. Now, I gave a much longer lecture about this, which included a lot of talk about sex connecting in New York not that long ago, and I had kind of a few people want to talk to me afterwards. And this is absolutely true. And a 27-year-old young social worker came up to me and she said, "Thank you." She said, "You were the first older person." Thank you. She's right. She said, "You're the first older person that I have any respect for that stood in front of a clinical audience and said good things about tech. And I am so tired of hearing older people say how we're all going to go to hell in a handbasket because of tech." And then 5 people later, I had a 63-year-old social worker come up to me and say, "I understand how you feel about younger people and their new technologies, but really, it's going to destroy their lives, isn't it?" And I gave them both the same lecture. And so I think therein lies some of the problem. We are having a generation gap. And the generation gap has been driven by social media. And if you're not in that world or you're not familiar with it, you're on this side of the gap and you really want to be on that side. So enough about that. Let's talk about treatment very quickly, if I can make it work. Oh, I see. All right. There is good news about tech, and I want to just put it out there that, whoops, sorry. So I run a treatment, I run 2 programs at the ranch in Tennessee, and we're a lot like you, but not. I mean, the ranch would have houses like that, but they're about a mile from the next house because we have a 2,500-acre working cattle ranch, which is mostly trauma-focused. But each program is separate on the property. So like the women's eating disorders program has 11 women in the house. They eat there, they cook there, they work there, they do all their clinical work together, and they have the same staff. And then the sexual disorders program for men, women, et cetera, and they're all quite far from each other. So there's no cafeteria, they don't go through any kind of institutional environment. And, but they are an hour out of Nashville. So if I want to take somebody to a meeting, it's a schlep, right? It's an hour in the van there, an hour in the van back, and 2 hours, it's like a half a day. So we take people to meetings 2 days a week, but we also do Skype meetings 2 days a week, where we put them in a room with Skype and we walk out, and they're anonymous people at a meeting, just like any other anonymous people at a meeting. And you know what's really great about that? Is they can go home and go to the same meeting. They can have a sponsor they see every week in that meeting. It's virtual, but they're there. And that has always been the problem about discharge, by the way, is that people go to lots of meetings and build a community, and then they go home and they don't know anybody. Well, we can help them develop environments where they have relationships with other recovering people, but they're not who they can pursue and have relationships with after they leave. So we do there are ways to bring technology into treatment, I think, that is very, very useful, like online meetings, online 12-step chats, all that kind of stuff. Okay, you all know how to treat addicts, so I'm just going to simply say that talk therapy, if you will, psychodynamic psychotherapy, Jungian psychotherapy, narrative psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, EMDR, all wonderful things, not useful for sex addicts, not in the beginning. Behavioral problems require behavioral forms of treatment. So sex addicts require structured psychoeducation, tasks, accountability, high accountability. I mean, the work is like any other addiction work. So gender separate, homogeneous by disorder. I know if a program is doing good work with sex addicts, for example, because they can say on their website they treat sex addiction. But if their sex addiction group has 2 people with eating disorders, 2 people who are chemically dependent, 2 people who have sexual problems, and a couple of people who are depressed in it, and that's their addiction group, they're not doing sex addiction work. Because unless you're in a homogeneous group, if you sexually act out, you'll never talk about it. It's way too shameful. And you'll be marginalized within the community. So you have to have groups that are specific to this issue, where same-sex people are talking about their sexual experiences, their sexual histories, not graphically, but in detail. Problem behaviors have to be contained first before real therapy begins. You know that. And I would say that most of us who work in settings like this, we get people ready for therapy. That's sort of how I look at it. Our work is high accountability, strong social learning focus. That's the idea of having 12 people in a house where they have to live with each other and deal with each other for 30, 40 days. I mean, I'm just stuck with you. And I may like you and I may not like you. And you don't do the dishes and we're going to have a whole family meeting about that. So I often tell spouses I help create family members. Group work is always more effective than individual with sex addicts because the group is going to catch things that I'm not. So a few required steps when working with sex addicts. A thorough psychosexual history and assessment, and I mean psychosexual. So you're not just doing a biopsychosocial, you're going through that person's entire relationship history and their entire sexual history. And you can do it, it doesn't really tell me about all your sexual experiences. Oh, and by the way, you have to define sex. Because, and I'm sure there's some people in this room who would agree, but I don't agree, that a blowjob is not sex, or a hand job is not sex. In other words, let me say, manual stimulation or oral stimulation is not having sex. I think it is. Sorry, I think it is. If you want to do it, out in the field with your kids watching, it's probably sex. So, at least that's how I tell my clients. So, but what I'm saying is, not only do I have to ask the questions, I have to define, what people's view of sexuality is, because people who have a lot of sex will often have skewed views of what they consider to be sexuality and not, so they can feel better about themselves. Clients, we have high accountability, again, to agreements. We confront denial. We educate and teach relapse prevention around sexual behavior. We put them in gender-separate, homogeneous groups. We find spousal support. I mean, this is basically what we do. We're directing healthcare, family, and crisis resolution. We're always in some kind of crisis with our clients. We're referring to long-term 12-step therapy or faith-based support groups. And I figure my clients will be in therapy for a good 2 or 3 years following some kind of intensive residential. Absolutely, my paired drug and sex addicts are more troubled than those who are simply sex addicts. What I find with the paired drug and sex addicts is that some of them have only had one relationship that went on for 3 months and they're 45, or they've been through treatment 3 or 4 times. They're HIV positive, both gay and straight. They have issues with gender orientation. They have a lot of abuse. So the male drug and sex addicts look a lot more like the female sex addicts that I treat. They're much more troubled. The men who are strictly sex addicts and don't have a drug problem seem to have been better able to compartmentalize their sexual behavior and be functional in the rest of their life. And by the way, women don't do this as well. That's one of the reasons why when a woman is very troubled around relationships and sexuality, women tend to see things in big picture. So it's harder for her to say, well, that's just that part of my life. A guy, sorry guys, we can stop off and go to get a lap dance and then go home and say, hi honey, how are you and how are the kids? And if we said to our spouse, listen, I just got a lap dance and that's why I'm in such a good mood, my spouse will say something to me if she's female like, I thought you loved me. Why would you do something like that? And I'm not thinking about love at all. I'm just thinking about getting a lap dance, because it is easier for men to compartmentalize and partialize a sexual experience than it is for many women. So the clients that I have who have profound sexual abuse, both male and female, they can't do that. Their whole lives have been affected by their abuse. And the men turn most often to drugs and sex, and the women to eating and sex and drugs and alcohol as well. And we have, in the eating disorders program at the ranch, we'll often see the women bounce back and forth between the sexual disorders program and the eating disorders program. You know, a woman will get a woman who has a lot of abuse will get into a primary relationship and start being sexual, and then gain a whole bunch of weight and distance herself literally from that person and from the intimacy. And then that relationship will end, and then she'll go on binges and lose all that weight and start being hypersexual. You know, and then she'll find a partner and she'll start gaining weight, and she'll go back and forth between those two things. So women act in, men act out. It all ends up being pretty much the same. This is the last thing I want to give you, and it's all I really have time for. And I think it's important. What is drug and alcohol sobriety? Abstinence, thank you. And what is, so no mood altering substances. What is gambling sobriety? No casinos, no fantasy football, no unsecured debt at the stock market. Okay. What is sobriety for an eating disorder? You don't stop eating, right? So with certain behaviors that are life-affirming, like sexuality and eating, when they run off the rails, we don't want people to stop. We want people to integrate them into their lives in a healthy way. So if I was working with someone with an eating disorder, we would look at, you know, what is unhealthy eating for you? What is healthy eating for you? We would put that on a piece of paper. It would become a contract. We would sign it. And then they could go to meetings like OA and say, I've been sober for 3 months, 6 months. And that doesn't mean they haven't eaten in 3 to 6 months. It means they followed the contract. So it's very much the same in sex addiction. Sexual sobriety is a mutually agreed upon, clear, written, and signed behavioral contract that's based on the client's goals. The plans don't change without prior discussion with a sponsor or a therapist, very similar to eating disorder. So it looks something like this. You know, what are the sexual behaviors that you need to stop? And these are often very specific. So it might be looking at internet porn, calling ex-girlfriends, cruising online for prostitutes, driving through the red light district, you know, whatever those things are. And over here, this is where the clients get really excited. They're like, oh, this is where the good sex is going to be. And unfortunately, no. What this is about is how do you have regular, consistent, pleasurable experiences in life that don't involve high intensity? How can you have small dopamine drip, if you will? Because that's what most of us experience in life. We experience small joys and small disappointments. And once in a great while, we have a big joy and a big disappointment. But addicts want to have intensity all the time. And so a good friend of mine said once, you know, recovery is, a life well lived in recovery is just one notch above boring. A life well lived in recovery should just be one notch above boring. I think that's about right. So I don't want my clients to have any mind-blowing experiences, to be honest with you, but what I do want them to do is start a recreational activity, start a creative activity, start spending more time with their family, start some meditation and prayer, you know, depending on what that is for them, join meetings, join groups, go to therapy. So I do want them to do a lot of life-affirming and fun things that they haven't had time to do because they've been in the pursuit of sex. And all of this is based on their very clearly articulated goal for treatment. And I just want to say that is that every sex addict I've worked with, and when they've come into my office and I said, what are you here for? And they said, well, I want to be a better person. It's like, well, didn't you want to be a better person 3 weeks ago? Like, why are you here now? You know, oh, well, you know, I wanted to be a better person 3 weeks ago, but last night my wife threw me out. Oh, okay, so you're here because you want to save your marriage. You're here because you don't want to get arrested again. You're here because you don't want to give another person HIV. You know, I can help you do that. Once I am very clear about that bottom line goal, then I can confront behavior, because then I'm always on their side. And they say, well, I don't want to give up porn. Porn wasn't a problem. And I say, well, but that porn seemed to lead to prostitutes. Prostitutes seem to lead to destruction of your marriage. Maybe the porn isn't a good idea for you. And they can say, you're just anti-porn, or you're too conservative. I can say, well, no, I want you to save your marriage. That was your goal, right? So as long as I am very clear on that, I can confront problem behavior and not get in a power struggle. And that is the most important part of the work, because I don't want to be in a power struggle with these folks. You have in your packets all this information, all the 12-step meetings for sexual recovery, sexual addiction, for spouses. You have our information about our different programs, 2-week intensive, the ranch, SASH is it's our national nonprofit for sexual disorders, and it has an annual conference, a peer-reviewed journal. This year the conference will be in Boston in the fall. Pat Carnes founded SASH. It's been running about 25 years. It's the Society for the Advancement of Sexual Health. They do training. They have a 2-day training in sex addiction treatment. You can get a certification through SASH in the treatment of sex addiction. That's our substances and sexual disorders program, and it really is for people who have dual substance and sexual disorders. One is paired with the other. Do I have ITAP? Yeah. This is Pat Carnes Institute for Training, and while Pat's around and still doing the work, if you have a real interest in this work, I would encourage you to go through a training. That's called a CSAT, and CSAT is Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. It is a very extensive training. Pat does a fair amount of it. It is not inexpensive. But if you see yourself doing a lot of this work, or you're working for an organization like this, they should probably send one person at least who just has that training and has that knowledge, so they can interview somebody or have know how to handle those cases. But you have all this information in your packets and in the handouts. Is there anything I can answer for you before we stop? Yeah, please.
Without DSM diagnosis for
Yes.
sexual addiction, how are people going to get treatment?
Well, the question is, without a DSM diagnosis for sexual addiction, how do people get treated? Well, the bottom line is that there's no insurance company that pays for any sexual disorders treatment now. So if you have a fetish, you have an erectile dysfunction, it doesn't matter. Sexual issues are already excluded from all insurance payment, just so you know. So even if it was in the DSM, it wouldn't be paid. But most of my clients come in, and this is the leading issue, but clearly not the only one. I mean, they're in crisis, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're going through adjustment disorders, they've been left, they have compulsivity, they have multiple issues. So if there is another diagnosis, we're certainly going to put it down. If there's not another diagnosis, they're going to pay for treatment. You had your hand up first, but then you took it down. So, or someone over here. Okay, why don't you go ahead?
You may have said this already, but I didn't get it. What's the percentage or the rate of sex addiction in our general population?
Understood to be 5 to 8%.
How much?
Understood to be 5 to 8%.
5%. Has that changed in the last?
We don't know. You all have to can I just say something about that? There's lots of money from the NIH and the university systems for alcohol treatment, understanding alcohol, drugs, gambling, eating disorders, sexual offending. There's no money for the study of consensual behavior. So it's only people in the private sector who say, I want to get a study going. Or when we steal a little money from HIV money or steal a bit of gambling disorders money, but this is why we wanted to be in the appendix of the DSM, so we could get money for research. But we didn't make the appendix either. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the virtual reality desensitization?
About virtual reality desensitization. Oh, you caught that. Virtual reality desensitization is a beta. It's in trial at the University of Houston. And what it is it's a headset that you put on, and it brings you into a virtual reality with smells and sounds and visuals. Depending on what you're dealing with, they will take you into a bar. You'll smell the alcohol, you'll hear the people talking, you can see the bar, you'll see all the stuff. And so what they're trying to do is, in vivo, live, they're trying to teach you you can use that experience to down-regulate and do relapse prevention. So, it's one thing to sit and do pencil and paper, like, where'd you go, what were you thinking, where'd you go, It's another thing actually to put the person in that place. They do it for pot, they do it for alcohol, they do it for smoking, and it's at the University of Houston. And there's some great YouTubes of it, by the way, if you're interested. It's on YouTube. Just type in virtual reality, if you can spell that. Virtual reality desensitization. It's a lot of language. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a diagnostic code of impulse control disorder, NOS?
We could use impulse control disorder, NOS. We can still use sexual disorder, NOS. There is I think in the DSM-5, there's something about technology. There's some kind of like, it is under the impulse control, but it has something to do with either gaming and gambling and online something or other. And for some people, it can go under that depending on their behavior. Yes, ma'am.
Narcissistic parenting.
Narcissistic parenting. Yeah, well, my mother's no longer living. Narcissistic parenting is when you're my child and my needs come before yours. So you come home from school and you say, Daddy, I had such a great day at school. I want to tell you about it. And I say, listen, kid, you had a great day, but let me tell you about my day. So the focus is me. And if you're not listening to me, kid, I'm telling you a story. I want you to listen right now. So the child doesn't learn that the most precious and important thing is this. They will grow up with attachment issues, and depending on the individual. I mean, we're very hardy people. We often will find somebody, a nanny, a nurse, a friend of the family, a neighbor, someone who will parent us, and if they do a good enough job of it, we'll be less scathed, less harmed. But you can read about narcissistic parenting in Alice Miller. Someone give me the title. The Drama of the Gifted Child is probably the best, earliest. But what happens is the child's reality becomes warped because they don't learn that they are loved because they exist. They learn that they're loved because they can perform a function for other people. And then they just continue to try to figure out what that function is. But this is empty. And when addicts talk about the hole in the soul, or the donut hole inside of them, they're often talking about that empty self. I can make you happy all day long, but I have no idea what I want or need or what makes me happy about it, except drinking, or using, or like that. Any other quick questions before we stop? Yes, ma'am.
I'm not in the treatment field or probation officers supervising sex offenders.
So your offender work, right, which is not what I'm talking about today.
No, but it was very helpful in the fact that,
Well, we do the same work.
yeah. So
Yeah, and that would be my question, how do you treat a pedophile that has sexuality?
Well, it depends on your setting, right? Because most offender settings won't talk about this, won't deal with it, won't have anything to do with it. And then it depends on your pedophile. Do you have a dedicated pedophile? Do you have a regressed or situational pedophile? Dedicated pedophiles are not treatable, but most of them are. So in a very similar way to the way you would treat one. The funny thing about the offender world and the addiction field is that the offender world says that they don't want anything to do with the addiction world, all the labeling and stuff, but we do the very similar work. We do cognitive behavioral, structured, accountability-based, breaking denial. The only difference is that we're very 12-step focused. And so we really put a value on people coming together after treatment because we know this is a lifelong problem. And that's actually my issue with the offender world, no offense to you guys, is that oftentimes you're not encouraged to put people in meetings because there's the fear that, they'll come together and they'll figure out how to molest children as groups and, somehow they'll find each other. And I just don't think, I think it's much more likely the case that they're going to go there seeking other people who are trying to not act out sexually. And 12-step recovery, I think, is really, really important piece that's missing from the offender world. But other than that, we're very similar, very, very similar.
she does supervise a sex addict who's child porn case.
Yeah, and there are, and child porn is a whole subject I'd love to talk about because the rates of people who look versus the rates of people who touch are very different. And they're not punished that way, but we know that they're different. So
I'll go on record and tell you that I have a problem with the public and sex offenders.
with Republican sex
No,
offenders?
the public, the general public and the
Okay,
sex
sorry.
offender registry,
Oh, yeah.
because
Our culture
society
is,
labels them when it's a disease.
our culture is very screwed up around this.
Yeah.
And what we do, and Anthony Weiner's the best example, is we take all of our sexual shame and we project it onto those people. We say those are the really bad ones. I'm not saying they don't need treatment, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation.